Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in for EI Live, the Eisenhower Institute's weekly series providing critical analysis of long-term issues. You can find our past events on YouTube and broadcasting Wednesdays at 11 a.m. on 91.1 WZBT Gettysburg. My name is Kevin Lavery, and I'm the program manager for the Eisenhower Institute's Gettysburg office. Our conversation today focuses on overcoming divisions between urban and rural communities. The last few years have accentuated real political, social, and economic differences, including how communities have been affected by and responded to the coronavirus pandemic. But it's also true that these communities face many shared challenges that present opportunities for dialogue and cooperation. Our guests today come to us from Urban-Rural Action, a national movement that promotes urban-rural collaboration to address challenges that impact all communities. Joe Bubman is co-founder and executive director of UR Action, a graduate of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He previously served as acting director of the Peace and Conflict team at Mercy Corps and worked to implement conflict management programs across several continents. More recently, he led a project on criminal justice reform in Adams County and Philadelphia. Shelby Kim joined UR Action in January as their Philadelphia coordinator. A graduate of Smith College, Shelby lived for a year in Lawrence, Kansas, where she saw firsthand the impact of the urban-rural divide. UR Action recently launched a new initiative, Uniting for Action PA, in partnership with the Free Library of Philadelphia and the PA Project for Civic Engagement. The Eisenhower Institute is also proud to support this effort, which they'll discuss during the conversation today. Our moderator for this conversation will be Logan Grubb. Logan is a rising senior at Gettysburg College, majoring in economics and public policy with minors in peace and justice studies and political science. He's also a Pennsylvania native and a participant in the Uniting for Action initiative. We invite you, our viewers, to join the conversation by sharing your questions and comments on Facebook. And without further delay, I'll hand the floor over to Logan. Thank you, Logan.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Kevin. And I want to thank our two speakers for being here with me today. I think we had a really productive meeting last week, and so I'm excited to kind of have this conversation with you guys. So just in jumping right in, Joe, when I was reading a little bit of your bio, I was really impressed and surprised to see how much work that you've done abroad. And so, how do you think that your work abroad has helped prepare you for any of your work with Urban-Rural Action? And, what were some of your inspirations for even starting this movement?
Sure. And thanks to Logan and Kevin for having us. I'm really excited to be with you today. As you alluded to, Logan, a lot of my work over the past several years was with an agency called Mercy Corps, where we were trying to manage conflict more effectively in conflict zones around the world. So places like South Sudan, places like Guatemala and West and East Africa, Southeast Asia. And what occurred to me, but also many others who have made this transition from sort of international conflict management to conflict management in the United States, is that a lot of the same dynamics we see overseas exist within our country here. And by that, I mean ineffective governance, right? An inability of elected officials across party lines to come together and address problems, divisive political rhetoric, economic inequality, divides between different racial, religious, and ethnic groups. And it occurred to us that maybe we should invest similar effort and undertake similar approaches to try to address some of those dynamics here in the United States. And those approaches really include coming together across these dividing lines, building relationships, having more constructive conversation, but also taking action together to address some of the challenges that communities across the country face.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's a really cool project that we're seeing here. And I especially appreciated how much emphasis is placed on nonpartisanship, and that we have kind of these divisive sides, and that, when you take away those labels, it's amazing how productive the conversation can be. So Shelby, I noticed that you're a little bit of just a newer member to the team. And so what do you think have been some of your most rewarding experiences as being a part of Urban-Rural Action just over the past several months here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as all of us, you and I have experience on the call last week with the 50, 60 people who are on, I think one really rewarding takeaway was knowing that for most of those folks, like we never probably would have even met each other, spoken to each other, seen each other's faces, heard each other's voices. And I think part of that is the sad reality that just from geographic, political, social divides, it's very rare that different groups, even if they, live in the same state or even, in the same county, lots of people never get the chance to interact. So I think it was really rewarding that through the preparation and through organizing this event that we were able to bring together people in a way that was very unique and kind of got to shake up those usual circles. And that's something that we look forward to continuing in our future meetings, summits, whether it's virtual or in person, is bringing together people who otherwise wouldn't meet and just using that as a jumping off point to question why that's the case and why there's, invisible boundaries, whether that's political, social, or geographic. So.
Yeah, I definitely think even in my short experience last week, that this is the opportunity to have this really productive conversation. So I saw that you guys too have started to have projects in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Hampshire. So could you talk a little bit about how you as a team go about picking these areas or cities that you feel could best be aided by the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, Logan. And the Uniting for Action program is one, as you say, that we're implementing across 3 different states. And it's a little bit different from our kind of standard program design to date. To date, we have tended to work in 2 specific geographies that are characterized by different demographics. So an example was our criminal justice reform program in Philadelphia and Adams County. And that was sort of representative of the fact that a lot of sparsely populated counties across the country tend to be characterized by relatively low levels of racial, religious, and ethnic diversity and relatively small percentages of foreign-born residents and more conservative-leaning politics. So a place like Adams County kind of fits that description. Whereas 200 miles east in Philadelphia, the demographics tend to be higher levels of racial, religious, and ethnic diversity, more foreign-born residents, more left-leaning politics. But yet they're only 100 miles apart. And so that's an opportunity to bring together people for positive interactions, to build relationships, learn about different perspectives, and really work together, roll up their sleeves and figure out, okay, which of these issues that impacts both of our communities, even though in different ways, whether it's food insecurity or it's racial divides or it's criminal justice, which of these issues do we want to take action on together? The Uniting for Action program is a little bit different in that, as you know, Logan, from your experience last week, we're working statewide. Mm-hmm. And so we had 15 counties across the Commonwealth represented, and we have that same vision for Maryland, New Hampshire. And I'd say, why those 3 states? A couple reasons. One is that those states, like most in our union, are characterized by ideological and geographic divides. Life in large urban areas, places like Baltimore or Manchester or Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, is different from places like Adams County, Franklin County, other places across the Commonwealth and in more rural New Hampshire and Maryland. But also we have a team of conflict management practitioners who are part of our broader network. A lot of the founders of Urban Rural Action, as I was sort of alluding to with your question and my answer to it in terms of my bio, come from the sort of international conflict management background and a connection to the Harvard Negotiation Project, where some of the frameworks for having more constructive conversations with people who have different perspectives originated from. And so we are leveraging the geographic locations of our team members to implement programming there, the same way we're benefiting from Shelby's presence in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so I think then a follow-up question to that would be, I know you had briefly mentioned it before, that this Uniting for Action is a little bit of a newer project for you, and that you've had programs before that are very specific to criminal justice or food insecurity. So do you think that there's certain programs that fit communities better? And do you think, based on your answers from last time, from just a minute ago, that Uniting for Action is this opportunity to find out what other problems besides those 3 programs that you have, people are really passionate or concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this program may be the model for how we implement programs in the future. And what's interesting is that, I mean, we're a young, small, scrappy nonprofit, and looking for more volunteers. So if there are folks watching this who are interested in our work, please contact us. But truly, as a young organization, you have to experiment with what makes sense. And there's nothing like a pandemic to disrupt the best laid plans. And so this program, for example, was really intended initially to be more about sort of strengthening our democracy and preparing for the 2020 election in a nonpartisan, collaborative way, but also the aftermath of the election, regardless of the outcome. And instead, we've adapted, I think, a lot of the people, as you know, Logan, we were talking about this before the broadcast, but we asked participants when they signed up, what is the issue in your community or across the state that you want to tackle? And we got a whole range of responses. Some people wanted to tackle race relations, and others want to deal with alleviating poverty and economic inequality. Others want to focus on the environment and education, or jobs and business recovery, housing and transportation. This whole range of issues. And I think the spirit of our program is, we as the organizers aren't going to dictate what type of program or project, I should say, you want to implement, or what type of action you want to carry out. This is a program where collaboration on any issue that impacts communities across the state can be moved forward. And we are sort of facilitators. We bring a process, we convene, but then it's up to participants themselves. And so I do think this feels, I'm just sort of thinking ahead to our unpredictable future, where who knows what the next big issue will be. I sort of like that this program, unlike the criminal justice reform program, is really open to anyone, regardless of what issue you might be most passionate about. And I think this is likely to be a model moving forward, rather than sort of focusing on only 2 communities and only one issue.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think then that you could talk a little bit about, for those who haven't been involved with Urban Rural Action, what kind of, you'd mentioned that you're facilitators, and I know just from the paperwork that you guys have passed out that this is about a year-long program that's going on. So could you guys just kind of talk about what the timeline is and how you kind of apply that to the different communities? So what's the first meeting that you have, and then how do you kind of move forward from there?
Sure. I'll start, Shelby, and feel free to add anything I miss. Along the lines of what I was saying a couple minutes ago, Logan, initially this program, just as it was going to focus mainly on strengthening democracy, it was also going to be kicked off at Gettysburg College, thanks to the Eisenhower Institute's support, late July. And then when we realized that that is now highly uncertain, we decided to kick off the program online instead. And so we are meeting monthly. We just met on Thursday of last week. We'll be meeting again in June. And then we'll either meet again online, or we'll just move to an in-person format if we're able to do so safely at the end of July 31st, August 1st, at the Eisenhower Institute, or at Gettysburg College, with support from the Eisenhower Institute. And then the idea is that from there, these different project teams, like yours, Logan, focusing on bridging geographic and ideological divides, would then sort of implement whatever project they've designed. And that's sort of the focus of our upcoming sessions. It's analyzing these interrelated complex problems and coming up with a project with a set of activities that will help address, even in a small way, but a meaningful way, some aspect of that problem. And again, these issues range from housing and transportation to jobs and business recovery to education, environment, racial divides, and so on. And we'd expect those projects to continue for many months. The scope of the project is completely up to participants. And then we'll convene again in January, God willing, at the Free Library of Philadelphia, Shelby's current hometown. And then coming out of that summit, participants will, again, in the months to come, well into 2021, implement those projects. So we have at least 2 in-person summits planned. if we're able to meet, they'll probably look a little bit different than we initially planned, which was like 100 people in one room. We probably have a much smaller group of people in various rooms. But that's sort of the program design as we see it over the next 12 to 18 months. And of course, we'll adapt as needed. Shelby, anything you would add there?
Just something that I have thought was a little fascinating, going from, you know, the initial plans and potential plans of meeting in person to meeting on Zoom, is that from the logistics side, a lot of the questions we had about, you know, how are we going to carpool, and we spent a lot of time looking at the whole map of Pennsylvania, and, you know, it's a very large state, and thinking about strategically what locations and, you know, how many hours would it take for people to drive. And it was going to be a really powerful thing to be moving people across the state to actually come together in person. Sort of like what I was talking about before, like that powerful idea of people coming together. And then to all be on the Zoom call last Thursday, it was really neat to see, you know, it almost felt like a shortcut, but it was like, wow, we can all see each other, you know, in our own living rooms, like online. And so that was a kind of cool, unexpected bonus of having to do it virtually, was that, you know, we were able to all come together just, you know, with a little flick of a switch. So definitely pros and cons, but it'll be interesting to have it be blended in that way.
Yeah. So I think you both have definitely touched on an issue that has kind of impacted a little bit of the work, you know, the current pandemic that we're in. So do you think that in terms of the work that you're doing and the scope of the projects, because I think that this pandemic has showed us that, you know, leaders and communities need to come together during this very difficult time. And I think the work that you're doing is particularly timely. So do you think, other than, you know, not being able to meet in person, that the impacts of the projects that we're trying to work on, like that they'll be impacted, or do you think that it will have just as much meaning even if we're not necessarily meeting in person and kind of connecting on that personal level?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question, Logan, and it's challenging to answer because we haven't quite had an opportunity to implement a program like this in the midst of a pandemic. I think, you know, one piece which you sort of alluded to is the relationship challenge. How do you build relationship in a virtual context? In some of our previous programs with gun shop owners and violence prevention advocates, or people on different sides of the criminal justice reform question, we've done things like blindfolded chocolate tasting and shared meals. And of course, that's hard to do. But if you have ideas for how to do that virtually, let me know. And so there's something potentially lost in terms of really strengthening connections with other people when you're not in the same room together. In terms of the projects themselves, I mean, there's a lot you can do to effect change, even through the internet. So whether it's raising awareness about a challenge in your community, whether it's coming up with joint statements, as we have done in our previous programs, where gun shop owners and Second Amendment proponents and violence prevention advocates sort of agree on a statement that they put out into the world that says, even though we disagree on lots of things, we still agree on these things. Like there are ways to promote gun safety and reduce violence. And so I think we'll need to see, my hope, Logan, in terms of the projects themselves, whether it's education or environment or housing and so forth, is that with small enough teams and the ability to sort of, you know, as things hopefully get a little bit better and restrictions ease, there's still an opportunity to gather in small numbers, right? We have project teams of maybe 4 to 10 people. And I think that there will be opportunities to do work in person that's required, but also leverage technology to do work that can be done virtually as well.
I think one of the things then that kind of came up for me is, on the flip side of that, if this ends up working really well, you know, that we're able to do a lot via this kind of Zoom world that we're living in right now, and that when we have the opportunity to meet again, that's great. Do you think this would be an opportunity for urban rural action maybe to start scaling up things in the end, where you're not just going within one state, but you might be able to do projects with multiple states?
Yes. We absolutely want to scale up. Our vision is to work in 50 states. And that's because the dynamics that we're talking about exist across the country. And just to give, maybe for those who are kind of listening and wondering, like, okay, like, what do you mean that these dynamics exist? Well, what I mean is that, if you take an issue like criminal justice, it impacts communities in different ways, but it impacts all communities nonetheless. So in a place like Philadelphia, which has some of the highest incarceration rates in the country, that's very different from a place like Adams County, which has this one county correctional facility with just a few hundred people who are detained in that facility. On the other hand, because aside from much higher rates of violent crime in Philadelphia, you have a lot of, I would say, questionable law enforcement methods where minority groups are targeted, where a lot of people are detained in correctional facilities because they can't afford to pay cash bail. Reforms are able to have a significant impact. And so rates of incarceration have declined dramatically in Philadelphia over the past 10 years, where in Adams County, they have maintained constant or increased over time. But regardless of these significant differences, where most of the people behind bars in Adams County are charged with things like substance abuse and maybe drunk driving. In Philadelphia, you have high percentages of charges of violent crime. Still, in both communities, you have a large number of people who are just too poor to get a fair shake by the criminal justice system. You have inequities based on racial inequities that manifest themselves in the criminal justice system in both places. You have families that are torn apart. You have taxpayers spending lots of their money on a criminal justice system that doesn't contribute to public safety. So to answer your question, Logan, I think that's just one example. But I think across the country in 50 states, you have issues like criminal justice, but also food insecurity and education and where the impacts and causes are different in large cities and more sparsely populated counties, but there's still issues that if we're really going to address in a meaningful way, we need to come together across our geographic divides, across our ideological divides, across our socioeconomic divides. And I think your question also got to, well, should we just do a program across multiple states? This is my interpretation of what you were asking, Logan, where maybe folks from Pennsylvania and Maryland and West Virginia can all join together. I would see some benefits to that for sure. I would also see some drawbacks, because I think that one of the nice things about sort of this Pennsylvania program for Pennsylvanians is that there is this sort of state identity that can be used to bring people together, right? Everyone has, well, I would think, some pride in being from Pennsylvania the way you are and living in Pennsylvania, and maybe also having a shared frame of reference. Like, we all know kind of what state legislation looks like, and it's different in Maryland, it's different in West Virginia, it's different in these other states. So we could consider that. And right now, I think we're more likely to scale up by sort of adding additional states, but doing intra-state programming rather than interstate programming.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a great point. Growing up in a town of, 2,000 people, I'm very aware of what it means to know a lot of people's names. And I think you're right that it has a lot more impact if you're able to find those commonalities that, whether it be Pennsylvania or something, Adams County, kind of at that county level. I think it works a lot more to kind of get concrete things done.
Right.
So I think then something else that would come up for me is, what are some of the most common challenges that you guys face when you're organizing these? And how do you work? And I know for those who aren't a part of it, we talked about the ABCs a lot, and we can maybe go through those a little bit. How do you maintain a nonpartisan dialogue? Because inevitably some of these issues that you'll be discussing might have, kind of fall along party lines. So how do you maintain a productive nonpartisan dialogue?
Sure. Shelby, you want to take that one first, and then maybe I'll add?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Logan, for bringing up the ABCs. I could give a quick rundown of that. I was able to work on a fun video with a couple of friends and fellow URA members demonstrating a unproductive conversation / debate, and then a more productive, empathetic, constructive conversation. So the A stands for asking questions. So a lot of people, when there is a disagreement that arises in a conversation, people tend to get defensive and sort of frame it as wanting to win against the other person and convince that other person, and without trying to expand and understand that other person's view. So that's why we encourage people to ask questions, and that's something that we practiced during our breakout groups at the meeting. And then the B is break down your own views. So in order for the other person to better understand where you're coming from, your thought process, your experiences, sort of laying out your own your views into understandable pieces. And then C is check your understanding. So that's, you know, really trying to listen to that other person and, you know, asking like, do I have this right? Oh, so I'm hearing from you that your view is this, or it sounds like you're prioritizing this, and really wanting to make sure that you understand what they're saying before you try to respond. So that's something that we practiced a little bit, introed in our meeting, as a good framework for having disagreements with people, with the goal of understanding each other, not with the goal of trying to convince them of your own side of things.
Yeah. And as Joe had mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Bridging Political and Geographic Divides. And I think it was really cool to see that everyone, for the most part of my group, we all wanted to have our understanding. That was the thing that we wanted to work on. So I'll be really interested to see how we as a team kind of develop, and you guys to see, are we able to not only ask the questions and make sure that we understand, but if it's someone that you might not necessarily agree with, you know, how can you have a productive conversation and walk away and say, well, I don't agree with them. You at least can understand the points that they're making about this.
Right. Yeah, and just to add to Shelby's response to your question, Logan, about sort of the nonpartisan nature of the program. I mean, I do think, like Shelby just talked through this ABC's framework, and that was used within a broader structure. As you know from the way your group discussion was set up, the structure can help sort of mitigate a little bit some of the tendencies that we all might have to sort of advocate for our own political viewpoints. And one of the things we're trying to do in the program is ensure that we have a broad range of ideological views, but also geographic representation and different sort of and socioeconomic diversity. In the context of the projects, which you mentioned in your question, Logan, I think that one of the things we want to encourage people to think about is not so much sort of what issue, what kind of policy, say at the state level, do you want to change, which is going to be harder for conservatives and progressives to come together to agree on, but rather what are the things in your community that aren't so clearly partisan. It's just like, how do we tackle food insecurity, or how do we help, the homeless population, or how can we address the racial divide? Things that aren't left or right. It's just, we want to strengthen our community. And I think if the projects focus more on what can we as community members do, rather than what do we want our elected officials to do differently, then I think it not only empowers program participants, but it also sort of erases the political identity that can get in the way of problem solving across these divides.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. So I want to pivot a little bit. We have an audience question here. And you had mentioned earlier that you always are looking for volunteers. So is there a certain skill set or background of experience that you're looking when recruiting volunteers?
Not specifically. It sort of depends on what an aspiring volunteer might want to do. As Shelby can tell you, because she's worn many different hats She starred in a video. She has recruited participants. She has emailed organizations that we've wanted to partner with. She has moderated discussions. All of those things are the types of activities that we could imagine volunteers helping with. We're also trying to raise our profile on social media. And you mentioned scaling up, Logan, and we're also we're looking for volunteers and team members who bring a spirit of collaboration, a willingness to listen and work across divides, and people who bring creative ideas for doing that. Shelby, anything you would add to the types of skills or activities that you think would add to the organization?
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention that it was a really cool opportunity for me to be one of the group facilitators, moderators at the meeting. I had never done that in a conflict resolution, like nonviolent communication specific context, and so that was really cool. I got trained on that, and it's been really neat to be part of the behind the scenes. But definitely, I'm mostly came to this work by wanting to learn. So I definitely don't consider myself a political expert by any means, and we would welcome anybody else who falls in the same camp.
Yeah, great things that I, as a participant, felt from just our conversation within my group, that it was very much a learning process for all of us, and recognizing that each community is different. And so if you want to start to bridge those divides, how, you have to look at them, it's not always a cookie cutter solution for all of them. And how can you kind of, what model is going to work best for the people that you have? I wanted to mention to all of our people who are watching or will tune in later that if you would still like to be a participant in the Urban Rural Action Uniting for Action program in Pennsylvania, you can register at their website. It is uraction.org. And Joe, you had said there's 13 counties represented currently.
15, yeah.
15, excuse me. And I know you had mentioned in our introduction that it would be great if we could have someone from every county, but please feel free to sign up. You said our next meeting will be in June sometime.
Yep.
Is there anything else you guys would like to talk about that maybe I haven't brought up yet about your organization, the things you have done, or maybe the things that you're looking for? I know we talked a little bit about scaling up, but where you want to see this organization going in the future at all?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say that, we talked a little bit about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the impact, and we talked about it largely in terms of the impact on the program and the inability right now to meet in person. And I also think that it's a time where maybe a lot of people listening to this broadcast and watching it are wondering, I'm just focused on getting by right now, and I'm focused on keeping myself healthy. And we recognize that this is a time of tremendous hardship, a time of loss for many people, a time when people are being impacted financially. Maybe they or their family members have lost their jobs. And I think that, to me, the power of this program is even more significant for those who are able to participate. This is a time when people can support their communities, where there's an opportunity to take any action that you think would improve well-being at a time when so many are struggling. And so I think that, this type of work is even more critical now, not less. It's not sort of a nice to have, but I really think that in order for our communities, our states, and our country to rebound, and not just rebound, but to come back better than maybe we were, because I think this pandemic has surfaced so many of the very troubling challenges in our country, whether it's the tremendous economic inequality and the fact that people who are putting themselves at risk every day have less access to good healthcare, and you could go on and on. But I think that this program provides a small opportunity, but a meaningful one, to take action with people who you wouldn't, as Shelby said earlier, wouldn't otherwise interact with. And so if you're able to continue to just endure some of these challenges during this incredibly uncertain time and participate in the program, we welcome it.
Well, I just want to thank Joe and Shelby for joining us today and their important work on this issue. I know that I am very excited to kind of see where we'll be in a year. And like I mentioned, if you are interested in learning more about the organization in general, or if you'd like to just visit their website or join the program Uniting for Action in Pennsylvania, you can visit it at uraction.org. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today, and we'll hope you join us again next Tuesday at 4 p.m. for our conversation between Susan Eisenhower and renowned pollster Ron Fouché about what to watch out for in this upcoming presidential election. So we'll see you all then, and thank you again to our speakers for coming today.
Thanks for having us, Logan.
Thanks, Logan.